My name is Tessa, and I am 30 years old. I serve as a cyber intelligence officer for the United States Navy. 3 days before Christmas, I secured early leave from my classified deployment, eager to surprise my family with a quiet holiday at home. Instead of a warm welcome, I found my 7-year-old daughter Mia locked inside an unheated freezing garage. When I picked her up from the icy concrete, I saw dark finger-shaped bruises blooming across her small arms. My husband Trent had left a sticky note on the workbench, explaining he had taken his real family to Aspen for the holidays, leaving my little girl behind to toughen up. Before I even reached the emergency room, the timer on my internal clock began ticking down. If you have ever trusted the wrong person to protect your child, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe because over the next 70 hours, I made sure my husband regretted every single choice he made that night. The drive from the naval base to our suburban neighborhood usually took 2 hours, but I pushed my vehicle to its limits, navigating the slick highways in just over one. Snow was already piling up on the manicured lawns of our upscale subdivision, casting a suffocating silence over the street. Our two-story house sat at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac, entirely dark and lifeless. There were no holiday lights blinking, no warm glow spilling through the windows. I pulled into the driveway, fully expecting to see Trent's luxury SUV parked in its usual spot, but the space was entirely empty. I walked up to the front porch, my combat boots crunching loudly in the fresh snow, and quickly entered my access code into the smart lock. The keypad beeped sharply and flashed a solid red error light. My access had been deliberately revoked. A cold knot of realization formed in my stomach. Drawing on military training, I bypassed the digital lock mechanism within seconds using a manual override tool from my tactical bag. The heavy wooden door swung open into a freezing, empty foyer. I dropped my duffel bag onto the hardwood floor and moved swiftly through the house, calling out for Trent and Mia. The silence that answered me was absolute thick with an unsettling emptiness. As I moved methodically from room to room, the wrongness of the scene became glaringly obvious. The main coat closet in the hallway stood wide open, completely stripped of every heavy winter jacket, insulated snow boot, and thermal scarf. The expensive electronics and minor valuables were missing from the living room shelves. The house felt abandoned, devoid of the usual warmth of a family preparing for the holidays. I stepped into the kitchen, the rising panic now a steady pulse in my veins. The ambient temperature inside the house was unnaturally low, indicating the heating system had been disabled. That was when I heard it. It was a sound so faint, I almost mistook it for the winter wind rattling the loose window panes. A low, rhythmic whimpering coming from outside, specifically originating from the direction of our detached storage garage. I sprinted through the back door, ignoring the sharp bite of the winter air, and crossed the icy patio. The side door to the garage was heavily deadbolted from the outside, secured with a heavy padlock that had not been there when I deployed. I did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. I delivered a sharp, precise kick directly to the locking mechanism, splintering the wooden doorframe and forcing my way inside. The temperature in the uninsulated concrete structure was brutally cold, easily dropping into the single digits. The sharp, acrid scent of leaked motor oil and freezing dampness immediately hit my face. My eyes quickly adjusted to the dim gray light filtering through the high frosted windows, and my heart physically stopped in my chest. Tucked heavily into the far corner, lying on a pathetic makeshift bed of broken, flattened cardboard boxes, was my daughter. Mia was curled into a tight, violently trembling ball wearing nothing but a thin cotton sweater and summer leggings. Her lips were a terrifying translucent shade of blue, and her teeth chattered so violently I could hear the sound echoing off the bare concrete walls. She looked incredibly small, fragile, and utterly broken. I dropped to my knees, immediately tearing off my heavy military-grade thermal jacket and wrapped it tightly around her fragile frame. When I pulled her into my arms, the sheer radiating cold from her skin sent a shockwave of pure adrenaline through my entire nervous system. Her body felt like ice, rigid and unresponsive. As I lifted her gently, the sleeve of her thin sweater slid up, revealing something that made the blood roar violently in my ears: dark, distinct, finger-shaped bruises wrapped aggressively around her upper arms. The marks were fresh, violently purple against her pale, freezing skin, indicating a severe recent struggle. Someone had grabbed my child with terrifying force, dragging her into this freezing prison against her will. I held Mia securely against my chest, scanning the dim, cluttered space for any indication of what had happened to bring her here. My eyes landed on the dusty wooden workbench just a few feet away. A bright yellow sticky note was pressed carelessly onto the surface, held down by a heavy wrench. I snatched it up, my eyes reading the hastily scribbled handwriting belonging undeniably to Trent. The words burned themselves into my memory instantly, fueling a silent, raging inferno inside me. The note stated proudly that they had taken everyone to Aspen for the holidays, that she was never truly family, and that he had left her out here to toughen up, so I could deal with her when I got back. I crushed the paper in my fist, the sheer audacity of the betrayal threatening to consume me. Trent had spent the last 2 years playing the role of the devoted, doting stepfather. He constantly bragged to his friends, colleagues, and neighbors about stepping up to raise the child of a fallen soldier, soaking in the endless praise. He built his entire social identity around being a savior. But behind closed doors, the reality was a toxic, suffocating dynamic orchestrated largely by his overbearing mother, Barbara. Barbara had always despised Mia, casually referring to my daughter as an outsider, a burden and a stray who tainted their pure, perfect family bloodline. Trent, desperate for his wealthy mother's approval and financially dependent on her favor, had slowly begun mirroring that same vicious resentment. I had deployed believing my husband would honor his solemn vow to protect my child. Instead, he had succumbed entirely to his family's vile prejudices, locking a helpless 7-year-old girl in a freezing box while they boarded a comfortable flight to a luxury ski resort. There was absolutely no time for tears, and my extensive military training eradicated any trace of blinding panic. I carried Mia out of that frozen nightmare, moving with deliberate speed, and secured her safely in the heated cabin of my vehicle. The drive to the local emergency room was a blur of extreme tactical focus. I cranked the vehicle's heat to the absolute maximum setting, keeping one hand firmly on the steering wheel and the other tightly wrapped around Mia's icy, unresponsive fingers. Every shallow, ragged breath she took fueled the cold, calculated anger building exponentially inside me. Mia's biological father had died defending his country, sacrificing his life during a dangerous overseas mission so that families like Trent's could sleep safely in their beds. His death had shattered our world entirely, but I had painstakingly rebuilt it piece by piece, genuinely believing Trent was the safe harbor we desperately needed. That comforting illusion was entirely dead now, replaced by a devastating, unyielding reality. I pulled into the hospital emergency bay, laying on the horn to alert the waiting medical staff. Within seconds, a highly trained team of nurses rushed out with a gurney, whisking Mia through the automated double doors and directly into the primary trauma center. I followed closely behind them, rattling off her vital signs, core temperature estimates, and the exact duration of her exposure to the cold with absolute, unwavering precision. The harsh, sterile fluorescent lights of the emergency room illuminated the frightening severity of her condition. As the medical team carefully cut away the thin, damp clothes and began rapidly applying heated blankets and warm intravenous fluids, the aggressive bruising on her arms became impossible to ignore. The physical evidence of abuse was stark, violent, and undeniable to every professional in the room. The next 70 hours would change everything. I watched the nurses work, formulating my plan. They were going to pay, and they were going to lose everything they loved. It was a promise I intended to keep. Let them enjoy the snow. The avalanche was coming. The harsh fluorescent lights of the emergency room washed the color out of everything, casting a sickly, pale glare over the trauma bay. I stood frozen in the corner of the small, sterile room, my combat boots planted firmly on the linoleum floor, watching a team of 4 medical professionals swarm my 7-year-old daughter. A nurse expertly started a heated intravenous line in Mia's frail arm, while another layered specialized warming blankets over her shivering frame. The steady mechanical beeping of the heart monitor was the only sound anchoring me to reality. My military training, the very discipline that kept me alive during overseas cyber intelligence operations, was the only thing preventing me from tearing the room apart. I kept my breathing measured and shallow, forcing my face into a mask of absolute stoicism. The attending physician stepped away from the gurney and approached me. He carried a tablet, his fingers tapping sharply against the screen before he looked up. His gaze was not comforting. He introduced himself briefly before crossing his arms, completely blocking my view of my child. He informed me that Mia's core temperature had dropped to a dangerously low level, confirming severe hypothermia. Then his voice dropped an octave, taking on a cold, authoritative edge. He stated that while the cold exposure was critical, the distinct finger-shaped contusions forming dark purple bands around her upper arms were of immediate legal concern. I met his eyes, directly refusing to blink or look away. As a mother, the accusations stung like physical venom, but as an officer, I respected his vigilance. I told him in a quiet, unwavering voice that I had just returned unannounced from a classified deployment to find her locked in a freezing detached garage. I explained that my husband, the man entrusted with her care, was completely absent. He flatly informed me that hospital policy dictated a mandatory protocol. He had already initiated a formal report with Child Protective Services, and an investigator would be arriving shortly to interview me and examine my daughter. A heavy, suffocating tension settled over the trauma bay. I simply nodded once, acknowledging his duty, and firmly requested permission to sit beside my daughter now that her vitals were stabilizing. Reluctantly, he stepped aside, though the watchful eyes of the nursing staff never left my back. I pulled a plastic chair close to the edge of the hospital bed, carefully taking Mia's small thawing hand into my own. The heated blankets were finally doing their job. Color was creeping back into her pale cheeks, a fragile, dusty pink replacing the terrifying blue. I sat there for what felt like hours, silently calculating every possible scenario, every legal defense, and every tactical countermeasure I would need to employ against Trent and his family. I knew they would spin elaborate lies the moment they realized I was home. I had to build an impenetrable fortress of digital evidence before they knew I was hunting. Finally, Mia's eyelids fluttered. They were hazy with fatigue, but immediately locked onto my face. A weak, tired smile touched her lips. I told her she was safe, that I was never leaving her side again, and that nobody would ever hurt her. She squeezed my fingers, a tiny gesture of immense trust that fueled the fire burning in my chest. Mia shifted weakly under the mountain of heated blankets. Her small bruised arm reached down toward the pocket of her summer leggings, the ones she had been wearing when she was thrown into the freezing cold. Her fingers fumbled against the damp fabric before pulling out a thick, crumpled object. She held it out to me with a trembling hand. It was a heavy stock premium paper envelope, badly crushed and stained with a few drops of motor oil from the garage floor. Her voice was barely a whisper, raspy from the freezing air. She told me that Trent and his brother Connor had dragged her out to the garage because she was crying about being left behind. She said her grandmother Barbara had followed them out, yelling at Trent to hurry up because their private car was waiting. During the chaotic, aggressive struggle, Barbara had forcefully yanked Mia by the arms, leaving those terrifying bruises, and dropped this envelope. Mia grabbed it and stuffed it into her pocket right before the heavy wooden door was slammed shut. I took the crumpled envelope from her fragile fingers, my heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. I kissed her forehead again, promising her a warm, safe sleep before stepping back under the harsh, direct glare of the medical lighting to examine the contents. The paper felt heavy, expensive. The return address printed in the corner belonged to a highly exclusive private wealth management firm, catering to high-net-worth clients. The wax seal had been broken, allowing the thick stack of folded documents to slide out easily into my palm. I pulled out the papers and began to read. The first few pages were glossy, high-end travel itineraries. They detailed a lavish, all-expenses-paid luxury vacation package to Aspen, Colorado. The names listed on the passenger manifest were Trent Barbara Connor and Connor's wife Simone. They had spared absolutely no expense booking expensive spa treatments, private chef dinners, and VIP transportation from the airport directly to the slopes. I shoved the itineraries to the back of the stack, my jaw clenching tight. The next document was a formalized, legally binding real estate transfer deed. It detailed the cash purchase of a massive multi-million-dollar estate located in one of the most affluent gated neighborhoods in our state. I scanned the buyer information expecting to see Trent's name. Instead, the luxurious property was listed entirely and exclusively under two names: Barbara and Simone. My eyes darted to the final piece of paper in the stack. It was an official bank receipt documenting a massive finalized wire transfer used to cover the absolute entirety of the estate purchase and the Aspen vacation. I read the account routing numbers and all the air completely vanished from my lungs. The numbers matched a highly restricted secure account that I had set up years ago. It was the Military Death Gratuity Fund. When Mia's biological father was killed in action during a classified overseas raid, the Department of Defense had issued a substantial survivor benefit. That money was sacred blood, money strictly and legally designated for Mia's future. It was meant for her college education, her health care, and her overall security. I had placed it in a highly secure trust, leaving strict instructions that it was never to be touched until her 18th birthday. Trent had no legal right to access it. I stared at the bank receipt, tracing the signature line at the very bottom of the wire authorization form. There, written in perfectly mimicking flawless cursive, was my own name. Trent had forged my signature. He had meticulously planned and executed federal wire fraud, completely draining a military survivor fund meant for a dead soldier's child. He and his family had stolen Mia's entire future to buy themselves a sprawling luxury mansion and fund an extravagant ski trip, and then they had locked that same child in a freezing garage to die quietly while they celebrated their stolen wealth. I stood motionless under the bright hospital lights, the crushed envelope gripped tightly in my hand. The initial suffocating wave of a panicked, heartbroken mother vanished, completely, instantly vaporized by a cold, absolute, and unyielding fury. I refused to shed a single tear. I refused to scream or break down in front of these strangers. The emotional devastation was instantly overridden by the cold, calculating instincts of a naval cyber intelligence officer. My mind shifted into a state of pure tactical warfare. They thought they had outsmarted a deployed soldier. They thought they had discarded a helpless child without consequence. They believed they were untouchable, currently drinking champagne in an Aspen chalet bought with stolen blood money. I would make sure they paid dearly. I would drag them down from their stolen mountain. I looked over at my daughter, now sleeping peacefully under the watchful hum of the heart monitor. I carefully folded the documents and slid them into the secure inner pocket of my tactical jacket. The attending physician was still watching me from across the room, waiting for the child protection investigator to arrive. He expected to deal with a broken, negligent mother. He had absolutely no idea that he was standing in the same room with a woman who was about to dismantle an entire family brick by brick. I pulled my military-issued mobile device from my pocket and checked the exact time. It was currently midnight. The countdown had officially begun. They had exactly 70 hours before their entire reality would be systematically, completely, and utterly destroyed. I stepped back into the shadows and prepared for digital war. I left Mia sleeping under the watchful eyes of the trauma nurses and walked down the sterile hospital corridor toward the 24-hour pharmacy. My combat boots made no sound as I moved with deliberate precision. The attending physician had prescribed a specialized course of thermal recovery supplements and strong antibiotics to combat the severe physical toll the freezing garage had taken on my daughter. I reached the pharmacy counter and handed the overnight technician the written prescription. He typed the information into his computer and gave me the total. I reached into my tactical bag and pulled out my primary debit card, sliding it into the payment terminal. The machine processed for a brief second before emitting a sharp, red denial beep. The confused technician asked me to try scanning it again. I swiped the card, The result was identical. The transaction was entirely declined. I stood frozen. I handed the technician a joint credit card I shared with Trent. I swiped the plastic through the reader and watched as the same red error message illuminated the small digital screen. A cold, familiar realization washed over me. I stepped back from the counter and pulled out my mobile phone, opening my banking application. My login credentials were automatically rejected. The recovery email had been completely altered. Trent had preemptively locked me out of every single shared financial resource. He had changed the master passwords, severed my access to our joint accounts, and frozen my debit cards. He wanted to ensure I was completely stranded in the city, with a sick child and absolutely zero capital. He believed that cutting off my money would paralyze me. He assumed I would panic cry and beg him for access to buy the essential medicine. He was totally, completely, and entirely wrong. I looked at the pharmacist and politely asked him to hold the medication for exactly 10 minutes. He nodded, looking at me with a mixture of pity and confusion. I turned away from the counter and walked directly into the desolate hospital cafeteria, located just across the hall. The room was entirely empty at this hour, filled with rows of vacant tables and the low hum of vending machines. I chose a quiet corner booth that put my back against a solid brick wall, giving me a clear line of sight to the exits. I unzipped the heavy canvas of my tactical bag and retrieved my encrypted military-issued field laptop. The heavy matte black machine felt cold and familiar. I placed the device on the plastic table and opened the screen, taking a slow breath. The real battle was starting right now, and I was completely ready for it. I powered up the device. The screen illuminated instantly, bathing my face in a pale blue glow. The system prompted me for my biometric signature. I pressed my thumb against the scanner and typed in my encryption passphrase. The laptop booted into a secure interface designed specifically for high-level cyber intelligence operations. I quickly established a heavily encrypted virtual private network, bouncing my connection through 3 separate secure servers located in different countries to mask my digital footprint. Trent was a man who possessed a massive ego, but severely lacked technical intelligence. He utilized the same basic, predictable security protocols for every aspect of his life. He reused old passwords, relied on easily guessable security questions, and trusted commercial-grade banking applications to protect his assets. He had absolutely no idea what kind of digital warfare I was truly capable of executing against his pathetic personal network security firewalls. As a trained cyber intelligence officer, I viewed his digital roadblocks as a minor temporary nuisance rather than an actual obstacle. I opened a command terminal and launched a specialized brute force algorithm. Months ago, when I first set up our home network, I had embedded a silent backdoor exploit into the main router for general household security monitoring. I used that very exploit now to bypass the banking authentication app he had installed on his personal phone. Lines of green code cascaded down my dark screen as my program systematically dismantled his rudimentary firewalls. Within 3 minutes, the system granted me full administrative access to his primary banking portal. I immediately located my frozen debit card and executed a command to unfreeze the asset, restoring my ability to purchase the crucial medication. However, simply getting my money back was not going to satisfy the blazing cold fury inside me. The anger I had ruthlessly suppressed back in the trauma bay now channeled entirely into my rapid keystrokes. Trent had stolen the sacred military death survivor fund to buy his family a life of luxury. I was going to strip them of every single financial lifeline they possessed. I dove deeper into the financial architecture Trent and his mother Barbara had built. I targeted Trent first. He maintained 2 personal checking accounts and a lucrative business expense account. I overrode his administrative privileges, locking him out completely. I changed his login credentials to a randomly generated alphanumeric string that he could never possibly guess. Then I altered his 2-factor authentication, routing the security alerts away from his phone and directing them into a secure burner digital inbox that only I controlled. He was now entirely blind and locked out of his own stolen money without any prior warning whatsoever. Next, I turned my attention to Barbara. She was the matriarch, the one who had orchestrated the purchase of the sprawling estate using the stolen future of my child. Barbara held multiple high-yield savings accounts, a primary trust, and an exclusive premium credit line. I bypassed her security questions with ease since I knew every detail of her life. I systematically severed her access to every account. I revoked her credit card privileges, reducing her spending limit to 0. I did the exact same thing to the brother of Trent. Connor was a coward who simply followed maternal orders, but he was equally complicit in the betrayal. I locked his banking portals, froze his debit cards, and disabled his digital payment applications. I moved through their financial networks like an invisible ghost, leaving no trace of my presence while destroying their entire economic foundation from the absolute ground up. Finally, I targeted Simone. The wife of Connor was the most materialistic of them all. Her accounts were directly linked to the primary wealth management portal that Barbara controlled. I isolated her luxury spending accounts and her premium travel cards. With a few swift keystrokes, I terminated her active cards, completely wiping out her ability to make any purchases. I ensured that every single member of that family was now financially paralyzed. They were currently sleeping in a luxury 5-star resort in Aspen, completely unaware that they did not possess a single functioning dollar to their names. They were holding nothing but useless pieces of plastic. But I was still far from finished. Locking them out was merely the first phase of my absolute retaliation. Now came the precise retrieval of the funds they had stolen from my child tonight. Every cent was returning to my full, complete control. I opened a secondary secure terminal and pulled up the routing numbers from the bank receipt I had found inside the crumpled envelope. I needed to isolate the exact dollar amount Trent and Barbara had drained from the military death gratuity fund. I meticulously tracked the digital paper trail, watching how they had moved the money to finalize the real estate transfer and fund the extravagant ski trip. I located the liquid assets they still held across various investment portfolios. Trent had parked a significant portion of his personal wealth in mutual funds and emergency savings, hoping to generate quick interest. I initiated a rapid liquidation protocol. I systematically drained their mutual funds, emptied their emergency savings, and hollowed out their vacation slush funds down to the very last cent. I gathered the exact amount stolen from Mia and prepared it for an immediate, totally secure offshore digital transport operation. I initiated a highly complex multi-tiered wire transfer. To ensure the money could never be tracked or recovered by any civilian bank, I routed the massive sum through a labyrinth of international servers. The funds bounced seamlessly from a secure node in Switzerland to a private terminal in Singapore before finally landing safely inside a heavily encrypted, untraceable offshore blind trust. I was the sole proprietor of this new account, and I held the only cryptographic key capable of unlocking it. The military survivor fund was entirely restored and securely hidden away from their greedy hands. The money meant for the college education and health care of Mia was safe once again. I watched the final confirmation message flash across my screen, indicating the transfer was absolutely successful and irreversible. I closed the laptop and securely packed it in my bag. Their absolute destruction was now completely, strictly, entirely inevitable. The final confirmation message vanished from my screen, leaving a stark, black void in its wake. The military survivor fund was entirely secure, but my mission was far from over. I took a slow, measured breath and shifted my focus to the next target on my digital horizon. Simone was the wife of Trent's brother Connor, and she represented everything shallow and parasitic about that family. As an African-American woman, she had built a massive online following by projecting the image of a highly successful self-made luxury influencer. Her social media feeds were an endless parade of designer handbags, private aviation terminals, and 5-star resorts. She sold a carefully curated illusion of generational wealth and limitless disposable income to millions of impressionable followers. Behind the digital filters and curated aesthetics, Simone was nothing more than an arrogant fraud. For years, she had gone out of her way to belittle my utilitarian lifestyle. During mandatory family dinners, She would stare at my tactical boots and practical clothing with undisguised contempt. She frequently made passive-aggressive remarks about how a real woman should pamper herself, mocking the long hours I spent serving my country. She built her glamorous internet persona by stepping on the backs of hardworking people while contributing absolutely nothing of value to society. Now I knew exactly how she funded her extravagant digital masquerade. She was wearing my dead husband's blood money. I opened a new command terminal on my field laptop and routed my connection through a fresh proxy server. Hunting Simone in the digital space was almost insultingly easy. Her desperate need for constant public validation made her careless. She documented every single moment of her life online, broadcasting her exact location and activities to the entire world. I targeted her primary social media accounts first. Like Trent, she utilized remarkably weak security protocols, relying on basic passwords that incorporated her birth year and the name of her designer dog. My decryption software tore through her primary login barriers in less than 40 seconds. I bypassed her two-factor authentication by mirroring the media access control address of her primary smartphone directly onto my laptop. Once inside her primary account, I possessed complete administrative control over her entire digital empire. I could see her direct messages, her archived posts, and her hidden analytics. But I needed the raw, unfiltered truth, hiding behind the glossy photographs. I initiated a secondary breach targeting her personal cloud storage drive. This required a slightly more sophisticated approach, so I deployed a phantom phishing script that bypassed the commercial firewall without triggering any automated security alerts. The digital gates swung wide open, granting me unrestricted access to the deepest, darkest corners of her fabricated reality. I began sifting through massive folders of unedited video files and financial documents. What I discovered turned the cold calculation in my chest into a blazing inferno. Simone had meticulously documented the entire Aspen trip from its inception. I found raw footage of her standing on the tarmac in front of a leased private jet, complaining to Trent that the catering was subpar. She pouted about the brand of champagne provided, completely oblivious to the fact that her luxury experience was purchased by leaving a 7-year-old girl to freeze in a concrete garage. The level of narcissistic detachment was nauseating to witness. I dug deeper into her localized storage and located a hidden folder labeled with the current year. Inside, I found the digital receipts for every single luxury item she had paraded across the internet over the past week. There were invoices for thousands of dollars worth of custom ski gear, high-end winter fashion, and exclusive spa treatments. I cross-referenced the payment data with the routing numbers I had extracted from the hospital room envelope. The match was absolutely perfect. Every single transaction was directly linked to the military death gratuity fund. Simone was literally wearing the money meant to secure my daughter's future. My fingers flew across the keyboard, driven by a precise tactical rage. I was not simply going to delete her accounts or expose her privately. Simone derived her entire self-worth from the adoration of her digital audience. She thrived on the envy of strangers and the false prestige of her fake wealth. To truly destroy her, I needed to dismantle her illusion on the largest possible stage. I needed her followers to witness the grotesque reality of her actions. I decided to build a digital time bomb customized specifically for her social media infrastructure. I opened a raw coding interface and began writing a highly specialized malware script. It was a delayed trigger payload designed to embed itself deeply within the back-end architecture of her broadcasting software. I engineered the code to remain entirely dormant, masking its signature as a routine background update. It would wait silently, monitoring her account activity until a specific set of parameters was met. I wanted maximum visibility. I programmed the trigger to activate only when her live broadcast viewership crossed a specific high threshold, ensuring thousands would be watching. Next, I compiled the devastating ammunition for the payload. I took the digital receipts proving that her luxury Aspen vacation was funded entirely by stolen military survivor benefits. I highlighted the routing numbers and attached the corresponding transaction dates. Then I accessed the secure portal of the hospital and downloaded the official intake report for Mia. The clinical document detailed the severe hypothermia, the dangerous drop in core temperature, and the violent finger-shaped contusions bruising her upper arms. I redacted my daughter's personal identification information to protect her privacy, but left the medical facts completely visible. I integrated these two devastating pieces of evidence directly into the core of the malware. The script was designed to forcibly hijack the video feed of her social media application. When the trap was triggered, the code would slice her broadcast screen perfectly in half. On one side, her followers would see whatever fake glamorous performance she was attempting to deliver. On the other side, the malware would automatically broadcast the undeniable proof of her vile criminal complicity. It would loop the bank receipts and the hypothermia report, continuously trapping her in a digital cage. I reviewed the code line by line, ensuring there were no errors or vulnerabilities that could trace the attack back to my location. The script was flawless. I executed the upload command and watched the progress bar fill as the payload transferred directly into the root directory of her primary social media account. The malicious software nested itself quietly into the system, completely undetected by the commercial security scanners. The trap was now fully armed and waiting patiently for the target to step onto the stage. I closed the command terminal and took a moment to stretch my stiff neck. The digital battlefield was secure, but the physical reality of my situation remained pressing. I stood up from the hard plastic booth in the hospital cafeteria and walked back toward the trauma bay. The lights buzzed overhead, casting shadows down the empty corridors. The adrenaline that had sustained me through the initial hack was beginning to level out, replaced by a cold, steady determination. I had successfully severed their financial lifelines and planted the seeds of their public destruction. I quietly re-entered the small hospital room where Mia was resting. The attending nurses had dimmed the overhead lights, creating a softer, more peaceful environment. The rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor was steady and reassuring. Mia was sleeping deeply, her breathing regular and calm under the heavy layers of warmed hospital blankets. The terrifying blue tint had completely vanished from her lips, replaced by a healthy, natural color. The dark bruises on her arms, however, remained stark and visible, a constant reminder of their violence. I pulled the plastic chair close to her bed and sat down, maintaining my vigil. The medical staff moved around us, checking intravenous drips and recording vital signs with professional efficiency. Nobody questioned my presence anymore. The initial suspicion had faded. I watched the steady rise and fall of the chest of my daughter, feeling the immense weight of the past few hours settle heavily on my shoulders. The immediate danger had passed, but the war was only just beginning. As the long night stretched toward dawn, I mentally reviewed the tactical board. Trent and his family were currently trapped in a freezing blizzard, completely cut off from all their stolen wealth. Simone was carrying a digital time bomb in her pocket, totally unaware that her precious online empire was rigged to explode. They had underestimated me in every conceivable way. They had viewed my military service as a joke, an inconvenience that kept me away from home while they enjoyed the spoils of my labor. They were about to learn exactly what kind of monster they had awakened. I leaned back in the chair and waited for the sun to rise. 2,000 miles away from the quiet humming of my daughter's hospital monitors, a completely different reality was unfolding against the snow-covered peaks of Colorado. The morning sun illuminated the pristine slopes of Aspen, reflecting off the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of an exclusive 5-star ski resort. Inside the opulent dining room of the lodge, the atmosphere was thick with the scent of roasted pine and expensive cologne. Trent, Barbara, Connor, and Simone had secured the most coveted table in the establishment, positioned directly beside a roaring stone fireplace. They were celebrating their stolen wealth with breathtaking arrogance, completely oblivious to the digital execution I had already initiated. Simone was orchestrating the morning with her usual performative grandiosity. Dressed in pristine white designer ski apparel, she continuously adjusted the angle of her smartphone, capturing the extravagant spread before them. The table groaned under the weight of their indulgence. They had ordered towers of imported seafood, premium cuts of dry-aged steak, and multiple bottles of vintage champagne that cost more than most people earned in a month. Simone documented every single plate, ensuring her massive online audience witnessed her fabricated reality. She framed the footage carefully, highlighting the luxurious ambiance, while her husband Connor eagerly played the role of the devoted wealthy spouse. Trent sat at the head of the table, exuding a false sense of elite superiority. He swirled champagne in his crystal flute, basking in the glowing approval of his mother. Barbara looked around the dining room with an expression of supreme entitlement, treating the attentive waitstaff as if they were personal servants. They carried themselves like royalty, entirely detached from the horrific violence they had inflicted upon a 7-year-old girl just 48 hours prior. There was no visible remorse or lingering guilt over abandoning Mia in a freezing concrete box. In their minds, they had successfully executed a flawless acquisition of wealth and eliminated a bothersome obstacle. They believed their new reality was permanently secured. The meticulous illusion of their generational wealth began to fracture the moment the waiter presented the bill. The leather-bound folder rested on the table, containing a staggering tab exceeding $4,000 for a single morning celebration. Trent did not even bother to glance at the itemized receipt. He simply pulled his sleek metal debit card from his wallet and dropped it onto the tray with an arrogant flick of his wrist. He returned his attention to his champagne, fully expecting the seamless transaction of a very wealthy man. The waiter returned less than 2 minutes later, his professional demeanor carrying a slight edge of hesitation. He leaned down and quietly informed Trent that the primary bank institution had declined the transaction. Trent reacted with immediate visible annoyance. He scoffed, waving his hand dismissively, and instructed the waiter to run the chip again, blaming the outdated machines of the resort. The waiter remained perfectly still, maintaining his polite but firm posture, indicating that he had already attempted the transaction multiple times with the exact same result. A ripple of irritation passed over the table. Trent pulled a secondary premium credit card from his wallet, tossing it onto the table, while loudly complaining about the sheer incompetence of modern banking security measures. The waiter departed and returned even faster this time. The second card had also been completely rejected. The comfortable, arrogant atmosphere at the table instantly evaporated. Simone lowered her smartphone, her curated smile faltering as she noticed the curious glances from the neighboring tables. She quickly reached into her designer handbag and produced her own heavily tiered luxury travel card. She handed it to the waiter with a forced laugh, attempting to play off the moment as a minor inconvenience for her online audience. She loudly claimed her husband simply forgot to authorize his out-of-state travel alerts. When the waiter returned for the third time, he was no longer alone. The general manager of the resort accompanied him, standing tall, with an expression of severe professional detachment. The manager did not carry the payment terminal. Instead, he carried a printed notice. He approached their table and informed the group that not only had every single card been violently declined, but the payment gateway had returned a highly specific federal fraud alert. The banks had flagged the accounts, freezing all assets and triggering an immediate vendor notification. Simone's premium travel card was utterly useless. Trent's corporate and personal accounts were returning zero balances. In a sudden wave of panic, Barbara practically shoved her own exclusive wealth management card into the hand of the manager, demanding he override the system and process the payment immediately. She threatened to have his job, leveraging her supposed high net worth to intimidate the staff. The manager did not flinch. He calmly instructed a staff member to run Barbara's card through the primary terminal at the front desk. The group sat in a suffocating, agonizing silence. Trent furiously tapped at his mobile banking application, attempting to load his account dashboards. His screen repeatedly flashed unauthorized access and invalid credentials. He tried his recovery protocols, but the system rejected every single answer. The realization that he was completely locked out of his own financial architecture began to drain the color entirely from his face. The staff member returned from the front desk and handed Barbara's card back to the manager. The manager looked directly at the family and delivered the crushing blow. Barbara's exclusive account was not just declined, it had been systematically emptied and forcefully closed by the issuing institution. There was no glitch, there was no security hold. Their entire financial foundation had been completely obliterated. The manager then dropped the final consequence onto the table. Because the payment systems had triggered a federal fraud alert, the luxury resort was legally obligated to terminate their residency immediately. The estate they claimed to represent no longer existed in the eyes of the financial network. The manager informed them that their booking was canceled and they were required to vacate the premises within the hour. Furthermore, the unpaid $4,000 breakfast tab would need to be settled immediately, or he would be forced to involve local law enforcement. The meticulously crafted facade of Simone shattered completely. She looked around the opulent dining room, realizing that the elite guests she had spent the last 2 days trying to impress were now openly watching their spectacular downfall. The whispers of the wealthy patrons cut through the quiet room. Simone frantically tried to hide her face, pulling her designer sunglasses down over her eyes, but the damage was irreversible. Connor sat frozen, utterly useless in the face of actual adversity. Trent attempted to salvage his shattered ego by raising his voice. He demanded to use the phone in the executive office, threatening massive lawsuits and claiming he was the victim of a sophisticated cyber attack. The manager remained entirely unmoved by the aggressive posturing. He signaled to the perimeter of the room, and 4 large uniformed resort security officers stepped forward. They surrounded the table, creating a highly visible physical barrier between the disgraced family and the paying guests. The security team did not offer any courteous accommodations. They instructed Trent and his family to stand up and walk toward the elevators. The humiliation was absolute and entirely public. Barbara attempted to argue, demanding respect, but a security officer firmly directed her forward, cutting off her protests. They were marched out of the dining room, like common criminals paraded past the very people they had considered their peers just 10 minutes prior. The security detail escorted them directly up to their premium luxury suite. The officers stood inside the room with their arms crossed, heavily monitoring the family, as they were forced to pack their designer clothing into their expensive luggage. The sheer panic in the room was palpable. Simone was hyperventilating, shoving her ski gear into her bags while checking her phone constantly, hoping her digital audience had not somehow witnessed the humiliating eviction. Trent paced the floor like a caged animal, dialing his bank customer service numbers over and over again, only to be met with automated messages stating his accounts did not exist. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows of the suite, the picturesque winter wonderland had rapidly devolved into a brutal, aggressive Colorado blizzard. The wind howled against the glass, driving thick, heavy sheets of snow across the mountain. The temperature was plummeting rapidly, falling well below freezing. It was a severe weather warning scenario, the kind of storm that grounded flights and closed mountain passes. The security officers informed them that their time was up. They were instructed to grab their bags and move to the lobby. The family, struggling under the weight of their heavy luggage, was escorted down the service elevator, deliberately kept away from the main guest thoroughfares. They were dumped unceremoniously into the grand entryway of the resort. The manager met them at the front doors, holding their seized luxury items as collateral for the unpaid restaurant tab. He informed them that local transport services were currently suspended due to the blizzard conditions. He then instructed the security team to open the heavy glass doors. The freezing, violent wind immediately ripped through the lobby. Trent, Barbara, Connor, and Simone were forced out onto the icy concrete of the valet staging area. The heavy doors locked securely behind them. They were entirely stranded. They possessed no functioning credit cards, no access to cash, and no active reservation. They stood in their pristine white designer ski suits, sinking into the rapidly accumulating snow, while the brutal mountain cold began to seep through their expensive layers. The majestic luxury resort loomed behind them, warm and inviting, but totally impenetrable. They were cast out into the freezing storm, entirely stripped of their stolen wealth and their arrogant pride. The consequences of their horrific actions were finally catching up to them, manifesting in the biting wind and the dropping temperatures. They had locked a 7-year-old girl in a freezing garage to die, and now they were experiencing that exact same terrifying cold firsthand. The avalanche I had meticulously engineered had finally reached the base of the mountain, and it had buried them completely. But this physical and financial exile was merely the beginning of their punishment. The psychological warfare was about to escalate. As they stood shivering and desperate in the Colorado blizzard, trying to comprehend their sudden, absolute poverty, I knew Trent would soon search for a lifeline. I knew exactly what he would do next, and I was perfectly positioned to crush his last remaining shred of hope. The hospital room was enveloped in sterile silence, broken only by the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor. I sat perfectly still in the uncomfortable plastic chair. The glowing digital clock on the screen of my military-issued mobile device indicated that a freezing winter dawn was rapidly approaching. I knew the psychological trajectory of a man stripped of his power and his stolen resources. Trent was a narcissist who operated entirely on the illusion of control. Now that he and his co-conspirators had been forcefully ejected into a brutal Colorado blizzard without a single functioning financial asset, his panic would inevitably override his arrogance. He would seek a target to blame. I kept my eyes fixed on the screen of my phone, waiting for the inevitable strike. When the screen finally illuminated, the caller identification displayed an unknown number routing through a local Colorado area code. He had likely commandeered a courtesy phone in the resort lobby out of sheer desperation. I did not answer immediately. Instead, I deliberately allowed the device to vibrate several times, using those precious seconds to engage my secondary tactical protocols. I opened a specialized application on my laptop, bridging the audio input from my phone directly into a secure encrypted recording software. Every frantic threat and piece of extortion he was about to deliver would be legally and permanently captured on a federally monitored emergency server. Only when the recording indicator flashed a solid green light did I accept the connection. I brought the phone to my ear, remaining absolutely silent. The audio feed crackled with the chaotic background noise of a busy hotel lobby and the muffled howling of a severe winter storm. Through the static, his strained breathing was instantly recognizable. He launched into a rapid verbal assault, demanding I repair a massive banking error. He attempted to gaslight me, weaving a frantic narrative about frozen accounts, portraying himself as the victim of a random technological failure. He insisted that I needed to contact the fraud department right away and verify his identity so he could regain access to his funds. I listened to his desperate voice with a profound sense of icy detachment. I did not offer a single word of confirmation or comfort. I allowed the dead silence on my end of the line to stretch out, creating an uncomfortable psychological vacuum. My absolute refusal to engage or panic clearly unnerved him entirely. His tone rapidly shifted from arrogant demands to aggressive, hostile accusations. He began to curse, blaming my supposed incompetence with our joint finances for the humiliating eviction he had just endured. He described the freezing cold he and his mother were currently standing in, failing to recognize the grotesque hypocrisy of his complaints. He demanded sympathy for enduring the exact freezing temperatures he had intentionally subjected a 7-year-old girl to just a few days prior. When his aggressive posturing failed to elicit an emotional reaction, he resorted to his ultimate weapon. He escalated the conversation into direct, vicious extortion, lowering his voice to adopt a threatening, malicious cadence. He informed me that if I did not immediately restore his financial access, he would personally contact the highest-ranking officers in my naval command structure. He outlined a sick, fabricated narrative he planned to deliver to my superiors, threatening to claim that my classified deployments had triggered a severe mental breakdown, resulting in dangerous paranoia and profound emotional instability. He promised to file an official report stating I was actively neglecting my maternal duties. He weaponized my military career, attempting to leverage my reputation against me. He promised that his mother Barbara would corroborate his fabricated story, providing false witness testimony to ensure I faced a court-martial and lost custody of my daughter forever. He arrogantly assumed that a dedicated military officer would instantly fold under the threat of losing her rank, her clearance, and her child. He spoke with the venomous confidence of a man who firmly believed he held the absolute high ground. I sat beside the hospital bed, watching the steady rise and fall of my daughter. The sheer magnitude of his absolute betrayal only solidified my resolve. He was attempting to extort a highly trained intelligence officer using a burner phone from a ski resort lobby while standing completely bankrupt in a blizzard. He possessed absolutely zero leverage and was oblivious to the trap closing around him. I finally broke my silence, keeping my vocal modulation flat, devoid of anger, sorrow, or panic. I utilized the same cold, authoritative tone I employed during high-stakes interrogations. I did not address his pathetic threats regarding my military command, nor did I acknowledge his fabricated claims of mental instability. I completely bypassed his extortion attempt. I delivered calculated tactical strikes designed to permanently dismantle his psychological defenses. I calmly informed him his primary concern should not be his frozen bank accounts, but rather his immediate geographical location. I stated as absolute fact that their luxury business class return flights had been permanently canceled. I explained that I had personally contacted the airline and voided the non-refundable tickets, reclaiming the funds back into my secure network. I detailed how they were now utterly stranded in a severe weather emergency zone with absolutely zero means of securing commercial or private transportation. The line went deathly quiet. I could hear his breath hitching as the reality of his geographical isolation crashed into his conscious mind. He attempted to sputter a response, but I did not afford him the opportunity to interrupt. I pressed the advantage, delivering the ultimate psychological blow. I casually mentioned the heavy stock premium envelope, describing its texture and the faint stain of motor oil masking its surface. I informed him that his mother had been exceptionally careless when she violently grabbed a helpless child in a freezing garage. She had dropped the very evidence of their massive financial crime directly into the hands of the girl they were trying to discard. I explained that I had thoroughly reviewed the real estate transfer deed and the bank wire receipt bearing my forged signature. I listened as a sharp, panicked gasp escaped his lips. The background noise of the lobby seemed to fade away, leaving only the sound of his mounting terror. He realized the true depth of his vulnerability. He understood I was not a confused, helpless wife reacting to a financial glitch, but an intelligence officer who had meticulously uncovered his criminal conspiracy. I did not allow the silence to linger, delivering the final devastating piece of information with surgical precision. I informed him that the crumpled envelope and all its incriminating contents were no longer in my possession. The documents proving his direct involvement in draining a sacred military survivor fund were currently being analyzed by federal investigators for multiple counts of wire fraud and grand larceny. Before he could beg or scream, I abruptly terminated the connection. I pressed the end button, permanently plunging him back into the brutal, freezing reality of the Colorado blizzard. I disabled the incoming call notifications on my device, allowing any subsequent frantic attempts to reach me to flow directly into a silent, monitored archive. He was left standing in a crowded lobby, holding a borrowed phone, staring into the abyss of his own making. He possessed no money, no shelter, no transportation, and no leverage. The psychological devastation I had just inflicted would consume him entirely. He would turn on his family as the sheer panic of impending federal prosecution tore their fragile alliance apart. They would tear each other to pieces in the snow long before the authorities ever placed them in handcuffs. I secured the fully encrypted audio file. The extortion attempt was perfectly preserved as digital evidence proving his malicious intent. I closed the laptop, returning it carefully to its secure compartment inside my tactical bag. I leaned forward gently, brushing a stray lock of hair away from the forehead of my sleeping daughter. The rising sun began to cast a pale gray light through the hospital window, signaling the dawn of a new day. I had stripped my enemies of their resources, their mobility, and their psychological stability without raising my voice or leaving the side of my child. However, I knew the battle was not concluded. They were arrogant enough to believe they had secured their stolen real estate. They would have undoubtedly dispatched private agents to ensure their new property remained completely untouched. Trent had meticulously hired an aggressive local attorney just before his departure to tie up any remaining loose ends. I needed to prepare for the physical confrontation that would occur the moment I returned to the house. I settled back into my plastic chair, my mind mapping out defensive protocols against the next incoming threat. I drank my dark coffee, fully anticipating the imminent legal assault approaching us. The 70-hour countdown ticked away relentlessly, pushing them toward absolute ruin. Morning broke over the city with a fragile, pale light reflecting off the freshly fallen snow. The hospital discharge process was highly efficient, allowing me to secure my daughter's release just as the shift changed. Mia was still incredibly weak, but the severe hypothermia had been successfully reversed, and the specialized thermal supplements were doing their job. I carried her out to my heated vehicle, wrapping her in an extra layer of fleece blankets before securing her in the back seat. The drive back to our suburban neighborhood was quiet, devoid of the frantic adrenaline that had consumed me previously. I kept my eyes scanning the mirrors, ensuring we were not being followed. The house stood exactly as I had left it, a dark, empty shell that Trent and his family had abandoned. But this time, I was not arriving as a desperate mother. I was returning as a fully prepared tactician, reclaiming my secure operational base. I carried Mia through the front door, bypassing the foyer and bringing her directly up to her bedroom. I adjusted the newly restored heating system to a comfortable setting, ensuring the ambient temperature was perfectly regulated. I tucked her into her own bed. Turning on her favorite animated movie kept her distracted and calm. I promised her I would be right downstairs and that the bad men were never coming back. As I closed her bedroom door, the oppressive silence of the empty house settled around me. Trent had left remnants of his hasty departure scattered across the living room, a discarded travel magazine, an empty coffee cup, and a trail of muddy boot prints leading toward the garage. He had been so incredibly confident in his absolute victory. I walked into the kitchen, pouring a glass of cold water, processing my strategy. The quiet morning was violently shattered by a sudden aggressive pounding on the solid oak front door. The knocks were heavy, relentless, and designed to intimidate. I did not flinch. I calmly set my glass down on the granite counter and retrieved my mobile device, accessing the high-definition exterior security cameras I had recently reconfigured. The digital feed displayed a tall, slickly dressed man in a tailored charcoal suit holding an expensive leather briefcase. He reeked of corporate arrogance and sleazy confidence. He was pacing impatiently on my front porch, periodically checking his gold watch with extremely great annoyance. Trent had undoubtedly hired this private attorney before fleeing to Aspen, a highly paid mercenary instructed to tie up the final loose ends of his criminal conspiracy. Trent wanted me completely homeless and destitute before he even returned from the slopes. I approached the front door, moving with silent, measured steps. I unbolted the deadbolt and pulled the heavy door open just enough to block the threshold with my body. The man immediately stepped forward, attempting to use his physical size to force his way into my home. He planted his polished leather shoe aggressively over the threshold, invading me. I did not step back. I squared my shoulders, establishing a rigid, impenetrable physical boundary that forced him to abruptly halt his advance. He looked down at me, a condescending smirk playing across his lips, clearly expecting to deal with a broken, hysterical housewife who had just discovered her husband had drained her bank accounts. He adjusted his silk tie and puffed out his chest, preparing to deliver his rehearsed intimidation tactics. He introduced himself as Bradley, a senior partner at an aggressive local law firm specializing in rapid property disputes. He spoke rapidly, utilizing highly complex, confusing legal jargon. He stated that he represented Trent, Barbara, and Simone, and that he had been retained to execute the immediate transfer of this property. Without asking for permission, he shoved a thick stack of heavily stapled legal documents directly toward my chest. I took the papers without breaking eye contact, my expression remaining entirely neutral. Bradley crossed his arms, adopting a wide, dominant stance on my front porch. He haughtily declared that I had been officially served with a mandatory eviction notice. He claimed that prior to his departure, Trent had legally signed over the entire marital estate, ensuring the transfer. He said the property now belonged solely to his mother and his sister-in-law. Bradley continued his aggressive monologue, his voice dripping with misogynistic condescension. He informed me that the deed transfer was already finalized and notarized, leaving me with absolutely zero legal recourse. He demanded that I pack whatever personal belongings I could fit into a single suitcase, and vacate the premises within exactly 1 hour. He threatened that if I failed to comply with his strict timeline, he would call local law enforcement and have me forcibly removed for criminal trespassing. He leaned in far closer now. Lowering his voice, he attempted to strike fear into my core. He suggested that making a scene would only further traumatize my daughter, and that a quiet, immediate surrender was my only viable option. He stood there smiling, waiting for the inevitable tears and the desperate pleading he was so accustomed to extracting from his victims. I looked down at the stack of documents in my hands. The paperwork was incredibly thorough, featuring official-looking seals and perfectly forged signatures. Trent had clearly paid an exorbitant amount of money to fabricate a flawless legal illusion. The eviction notice was ruthless. It was drafted with precision, designed to legally obliterate my right to remain in the home. But as a trained intelligence officer, I recognized immediately that this elaborate legal assault was built upon a fundamentally flawed premise. They had constructed a massive iron fortress on top of digital quicksand. I slowly raised my eyes from the documents and met his arrogant stare. I did not raise my voice. I did not exhibit a single micro-expression of distress. I simply asked him to remain standing exactly where he was. I turned my back on him, leaving the door completely open. I walked down the hallway and entered my home office, closing the door behind me. I approached a concealed, heavy steel safe hidden behind a false bookshelf panel. I entered a complex 12-digit biometric passcode and turned the heavy mechanical dial. The safe hissed open, revealing stacks of classified military files and essential financial records. I bypassed the standard folders and retrieved a thick manila envelope stamped with the insignia of a highly specialized federal holding company. Inside was the heavily redacted original property deed and the authentic articles of incorporation. I slid the critical documents out carefully now, double-checking the finalized signatures and the unalterable federal timestamps. I knew the truth was securely in my hands, perfectly preserved and ready for deployment. I returned to the foyer, my footsteps echoing steadily against the hardwood floor. Bradley was still standing in the doorway, checking his phone with an expression of bored impatience. He clearly assumed I had retreated to pack my bags, or frantically call a divorce attorney who would inevitably tell me I had already lost. When I appeared empty-handed, his smug smile faltered slightly. I stepped right up to the threshold, forcing direct eye contact. I calmly handed him the thick manila envelope containing the authentic property deed. I instructed him to carefully review the highlighted sections on the second page, specifically the legally binding ownership parameters and the corporate registration details. I maintained my cold, authoritative posture, watching his eyes dart across the dense legal text. Bradley let out a short, dismissive laugh as he pulled the documents from the envelope. He began scanning the pages, clearly expecting to find a desperate, amateurish attempt at a counterclaim. But as his eyes traced the complex legal framework and the federal watermarks, his confidence vanished. The color began to rapidly drain from his face, leaving him a sickly shade of gray. His eyes widened in absolute shock as he read the undeniable truth. The suburban house we were currently standing in was never in the name of Trent. It had never belonged to him, not for a single fraction of a second. Trent possessed absolutely no equity, no ownership rights, and zero legal authority over the premises. His elaborate deed transfer to Barbara and Simone was not just invalid, it was a massive, highly illegal fabrication. I did not give him a chance to respond. I delivered the tactical strike with ruthless clarity. I informed the stuttering attorney that the entire property was purchased entirely in cash through a highly specialized veteran support limited liability company. I revealed that I was the sole proprietor and the exclusive controlling director of that specific federal entity. The corporate shield was established to protect my assets during highly classified overseas military deployments. I explained that Trent's name was merely listed on a temporary residential lease agreement, granting him the status of a basic tenant and nothing more. He attempted to legally gift a house he rented. Bradley stared at the heavy manila envelope in his trembling hands. The crisp morning air suddenly seemed to choke him. The arrogant sneer that had painted his face just moments ago completely dissolved, replaced by the terrifying realization that he had just stepped into a massive federal trap. His eyes darted frantically across the authentic articles of incorporation and the heavily redacted property deed. The federal watermarks glared back at him, serving as undeniable proof that my veteran support, limited liability company owned the ground he was currently standing on. He had marched up to my front door aggressively demanding I vacate my own property, based entirely on a completely fraudulent document fabricated by a desperate, financially ruined man. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing against his tight silk collar. His hands shook so violently that the fake eviction notice he had tried to serve me slipped from his fingers and scattered across the snow-covered porch. He opened his mouth to speak, attempting to backpedal, attempting to claim attorney-client privilege and distance himself from the catastrophic fraud Trent had orchestrated. He tried to stammer out an apology, claiming he was completely unaware that the initial deed was a forgery. I stood in the doorway, my posture unyielding and my expression completely devoid of mercy. I informed him that ignorance of his client's massive financial crimes did not absolve him of aggressively participating in the extortion of an active-duty military officer. Before Bradley could turn and flee toward his luxury sedan parked in my driveway, the quiet suburban silence was violently shattered. The wail of approaching sirens echoed through the cold morning air, growing deafeningly loud within seconds. Brilliant flashes of red and blue light bounced fiercely off the pristine white snow, illuminating the neighborhood. I watched as Bradley spun around, his eyes wide with absolute panic. He looked back at me, demanding to know what I had done. I casually informed him that the moment I identified him on my exterior security cameras, I had utilized my encrypted mobile device to trigger a silent federal distress signal. 3 local police cruisers swarmed the cul-de-sac, their tires sliding slightly on the icy pavement, before coming to a harsh, aggressive halt, blocking his vehicle completely. But they were not alone. Because the underlying crime involved the brazen theft of a sacred military death gratuity fund and the subsequent endangerment of a military dependent, the situation immediately escalated to federal jurisdiction. 2 dark, heavy, armored sport utility vehicles bearing the distinct authoritative insignia of the military police pulled up directly behind the local cruisers. Heavily armed officers stepped out onto the street, their tactical boots hitting the asphalt with military precision. Bradley began to hyperventilate. He raised his hands in a frantic gesture of surrender, attempting to utilize his polished courtroom voice to de-escalate the massive tactical response converging on my front lawn. He shouted that he was a senior partner at a prestigious law firm, that this was simply a routine civil dispute over marital property, and that a terrible misunderstanding had occurred. The lead military police officer, a tall, imposing man with a stern, deeply lined face, marched directly up the driveway, flanked by 2 local deputies. He ignored the frantic legal jargon spilling from the mouth of the attorney and looked directly at me. I stepped forward, handing the officer the thick manila envelope containing the authentic corporate deed alongside the scattered pages of the forged eviction notice Bradley had tried to enforce. I delivered my report with cold, absolute military precision. I stated clearly and concisely that the man standing before them was actively participating in a coordinated extortion attempt against a naval cyber intelligence officer. I confirmed that he had presented forged legal documents in an aggressive attempt to illegally evict me and my recovering 7-year-old daughter from a federally protected property. I also noted his attempt to use physical intimidation by blocking my doorway. The local deputies did not hesitate for a single fraction of a second. They grabbed Bradley by the shoulders of his expensive tailored suit, spinning him around roughly and slamming his chest against the cold hood of his own car. The sharp, metallic click of handcuffs echoed across the driveway, snapping shut around his wrists. Bradley shrieked in protest, begging them to call his firm, claiming his career would be permanently destroyed by this arrest. The lead military police officer stepped close to him, advising him in a low, dangerous tone that his civilian career was the absolute least of his current problems. He was now facing severe federal charges for accessory to wire fraud extortion and handling forged documents related to a military dependent. The commotion had drawn the attention of the entire neighborhood. Doors opened and curtains twitched as the residents of our quiet, upscale subdivision stepped out onto their snowy porches, pulling their thick winter robes tightly around themselves. They watched in stunned silence as the slick, arrogant attorney who had strutted up to my door just 10 minutes earlier was now being read his Miranda rights and forcefully shoved into the back of a freezing police cruiser. Trent had desperately wanted to strip me of my dignity and leave me homeless on the street. Instead, I had just orchestrated the spectacular public humiliation and arrest of his highly paid legal mercenary right on my front lawn. The local cruisers backed out of the cul-de-sac, carrying the disgraced lawyer away to the precinct for extensive federal questioning. The military police officers remained on site, establishing a secure perimeter around the property. The lead officer returned my authentic documents, exchanging a firm nod of mutual respect before taking his position at the edge of the driveway. The immediate external threat had been successfully neutralized, but my tactical operation was still advancing. I needed to ensure that my physical operational base was as completely impenetrable as my digital fortress. I stepped back inside the house, closing the heavy wooden door behind me. I walked upstairs and gently opened the door to the bedroom of my daughter. Mia was still resting peacefully, her eyes fixed on the colorful animated movie playing on the screen. The heavy thermal blankets kept her warm and safe. I kissed her forehead, assuring her everything was perfectly fine, before returning to the main floor. I pulled my encrypted laptop from my tactical bag and placed a secure call to a private military contracting firm I had utilized during previous domestic intelligence assignments. I required a rapid deployment team, and I possessed the unlimited capital to secure their immediate absolute priority. Within 45 minutes, an unmarked black utility van pulled into my driveway, clearing the military checkpoint I had established outside. A highly efficient crew of 4 tactical security specialists stepped out carrying heavy equipment cases and advanced diagnostic tools. I did not need to explain the situation beyond my exact technical requirements. They moved through my home with silent, practiced precision. Their first objective was the complete systematic eradication of the basic commercial-grade security hardware Trent had installed. They ripped the cheap smart locks out of the front and back doors, discarding the useless keypads that Trent thought would keep me locked out of my own home. They removed the vulnerable wireless cameras he had mounted above the garage and the patio, severing his ability to monitor the property through his compromised mobile applications. Every single piece of consumer technology was stripped from the walls and unceremoniously tossed into a heavy plastic bin. I wanted absolutely no trace of his pathetic security network remaining on my property. In their place, the tactical crew installed highly advanced military-grade security infrastructure. The exterior doors were fitted with heavy, reinforced biometric deadbolts, requiring a specific fingerprint and retinal scan combination to disengage the locking mechanism. These locks were built to withstand immense physical force and could not be bypassed by any conventional commercial tools. They installed specialized shatterproof film across every ground floor window, embedding localized vibration sensors directly into the glass panes. Any unauthorized attempt to strike or break the windows would instantly trigger a deafening localized alarm and send a direct alert to my secure command terminal. Next, they mounted high-definition infrared surveillance cameras at every external vulnerability point. These cameras possessed advanced night vision capabilities and localized motion tracking. They were not connected to any vulnerable commercial cloud server. Instead, the security team hardwired the video feeds directly into an encrypted localized server tower they installed inside my hidden office safe. I established a secure digital bridge linking the entire surveillance network directly to my field laptop, giving me absolute uninterrupted oversight of the entire property perimeter. The entire installation and security sweep was completed in under an hour. The tactical crew packed their equipment, handed me the primary administrative access codes, and departed the property as quietly as they had arrived. I stood in the center of my living room, holding the master control tablet. The house was now completely sealed, entirely modernized, and absolutely impregnable. I walked over to the new biometric lock on the front door, pressing my thumb against the glass reader. The heavy steel bolts slid into place with a deeply satisfying mechanical thud. Trent had assumed he could effortlessly lock me out of my own life. He believed changing a simple passcode on a cheap plastic keypad would leave me freezing on the porch holding a sick child. Now the reality was violently reversed. He and his vile family were currently stranded 2,000 miles away, completely bankrupt and shivering in a brutal mountain blizzard. When they finally managed to drag themselves back to this city, they would discover that the house they thought they owned was a literal fortress. They would find their keys utterly useless, their access codes completely deleted, and their physical presence entirely barred from the premises. The physical perimeter was entirely secure, setting the perfect stage for their desperate, pathetic return. I walked into the kitchen, poured myself a fresh cup of dark coffee, and prepared to watch the absolute destruction of their final remaining shred of hope. The pounding on my reinforced front door echoed through the quiet suburban morning, creating a frantic, rhythmic percussion of complete desperation. I remained comfortably seated in my living room command center, the warm ceramic of my coffee mug resting lightly in my hands. The high-definition security monitors displayed the spectacular collapse of their arrogant facade. Trent was slamming his fist against the heavy steel core door, his face contorted in a pathetic display of impotent rage. Barbara stood shivering behind him, her designer coat wrinkled and stained from the 30-hour bus ride, while Connor uselessly paced the icy walkway. But my attention shifted entirely to Simone. Simone realized that physical force was yielding absolutely no results. Her luxury lifestyle had been obliterated, her access denied, and her comfort stripped away. Driven by a desperate need to reclaim control, she turned to the only weapon she had left. I watched through the overhead camera as she pulled her smartphone from her pocket. She frantically smoothed her disheveled hair, pinched her cheeks to simulate a flushed, distressed appearance, and positioned herself squarely in front of my locked door. She was preparing a performance. I opened a secondary window on my encrypted laptop, navigating directly to her public social media profile. Within seconds, the notification flashed across the screen, indicating she had initiated a live broadcast. She was a master manipulator of digital empathy. I watched the live feed load, her face filling the screen. She immediately began to weep, producing flawless manufactured tears that rolled down her cheeks. She spoke directly to her audience, crafting a vile, fabricated narrative of extreme victimhood. She claimed that she and her family had been violently locked out of their own home by her deranged, unstable military sister-in-law. She weaponized her identity, accusing me of severe racial profiling and unhinged hostility, painting herself as a helpless target of a brutal, unprovoked assault. She begged her followers for support, claiming she was currently stranded in the freezing cold, while a violent veteran held her property hostage. The viewer count on her broadcast skyrocketed exponentially. Thousands of people drawn by the chaotic drama, and her desperate pleas flooded into the digital stream. The comments section scrolled past at a dizzying speed, filled with outrage directed entirely at me. Her followers offered prayers, expressed fierce anger on her behalf, and demanded justice for the seemingly innocent influencer shivering on a porch. She was feeding off of their blind loyalty, her performance reaching a crescendo of theatrical agony. She held the camera up to show the locked door, framing herself as the ultimate martyr facing unimaginable cruelty from a heartless enemy. This was the exact moment I had been waiting for. She had gathered the largest possible audience, creating the perfect stage for her own public execution. I set my coffee mug down on the table and rested my fingers over the keyboard of my field laptop. I accessed the dormant malware script I had carefully embedded deep within the back-end architecture of her social media accounts days ago. The code had remained entirely hidden quietly, bypassing all commercial security scanners, waiting for my direct command. I watched her wipe a fake tear from her eye, soaking up the digital adoration of 30,000 active viewers. I pressed the execute key. The response was instantaneous and absolutely catastrophic for her carefully curated empire. On the monitors, I saw Simone tap her screen in sudden confusion. On the live broadcast, her digital platform violently hijacked itself. The viewing screen abruptly and perfectly split directly down the middle. The left side continued to show her manufactured, tearful face, now twisting into an expression of genuine, unadulterated panic. The right side of this broadcast was entirely taken over by the irrefutable, devastating evidence I had compiled. The automated script began looping the brutal truth to her entire audience. First, it displayed the highly sensitive emergency room intake photographs of my 7-year-old daughter. I had redacted her face and personal identification, but the physical damage was glaringly obvious. The images clearly showed the terrifying blue tint of severe hypothermia and the violent dark purple finger-shaped contusions wrapped aggressively around her small arms. Below the images, the official medical report scrolled in crisp, undeniable text, detailing the exact duration of her exposure in the freezing garage and the precise nature of the physical abuse inflicted upon her. Before her audience could even process the horrific medical documentation, the malware flashed the second wave of evidence. The screen transitioned to a side-by-side comparison of recent luxury purchases. Next to the glossy photographs of her holding designer ski gear and posing on the tarmac in Aspen, the script displayed the authentic, unalterable banking routing numbers. It showed the exact wire transfers originating from the sacred military death gratuity fund belonging to a dead soldier. The documents highlighted the precise path the money took, proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that every single thread of her glamorous lifestyle was purchased with the stolen blood money of an abused, freezing child. The reaction was a digital shockwave. The comments section, which just seconds prior had been a unified wall of support and sympathy, completely stopped. There was a fraction of a second of collective disbelief before the absolute fury of the internet was unleashed. The tide turned with vicious, terrifying speed. The very followers she had cultivated and relied upon to feed her narcissistic ego transformed instantly into a ruthless, furious mob. Thousands of comments flooded the screen simultaneously, demanding answers, expressing profound disgust, and utterly eviscerating her character. People recognized the bank documents. They read the medical reports. They saw the undeniable link between her fraudulent luxury and the violent abuse of a military dependent. They began tagging local law enforcement agencies, federal authorities, and major news outlets right there in the live chat. Sponsors and brand partners who had previously endorsed her page began dropping automated messages in the feed, publicly severing all ties and terminating their contracts in real time. Her entire career, her reputation, and her carefully constructed social standing were being systematically burned to the ground in front of an audience of tens of thousands. On the security feed, I watched Simone desperately claw at her phone. She was hyperventilating, jabbing her manicured fingers against the glass screen in a frantic, futile attempt to terminate the broadcast. The malware I had engineered was flawless. It had entirely locked her out of her own device, disabling the power functions and overriding the application controls. She could not stop the stream. She could not delete the evidence. She could only stand there trapped on my front porch, watching her life disintegrate. She dropped the phone onto the icy concrete, backing away from it, as if it had physically burned her hands. Barbara and Connor crowded around the dropped device, their faces contorting in horror as they realized the magnitude of the exposure. They were no longer anonymous thieves hiding behind a locked door. Their faces, their names, and their specific crimes were currently being broadcast to the entire world. The public execution was absolute. Simone collapsed against the brick facade of the house, burying her face in her hands, her fake tears replaced by genuine, suffocating despair. The empire she had built on lies and stolen money had been eradicated in less than 3 minutes, leaving nothing but a smoking digital crater. Trent stood apart from them, staring at the locked front door with a look of pure, unhinged desperation. The exposure of their financial crimes and the undeniable proof of child abuse had backed him into an impossible corner. He realized that retreating was no longer an option. The authorities would already be receiving the viral footage. His reputation as a devoted stepfather was completely destroyed, and the reality of his impending federal prosecution was settling heavily onto his shoulders. The public humiliation did not break him into submission. It drove him into a state of feral, violent panic. He paced back and forth, his breathing ragged. I watched through the high-definition cameras as Trent turned away from the sobbing mess of his family on the front porch. His eyes were wide, darting erratically across the exterior of the property. He realized the reinforced front door was impenetrable, and the smart locks were entirely beyond his control. His arrogant entitlement was entirely replaced by raw, aggressive survival instinct. He needed to get inside. He needed to physically reach me, to force me to reverse the digital destruction, and to destroy the physical evidence I held. He began moving briskly down the side walkway, disappearing from the view of the primary porch camera, heading directly toward the rear perimeter of the property. He was severely underestimating the defensive capabilities of the fortress I had built, completely unaware that his violent escalation was the exact movement I had been patiently waiting for. The clock on my command console flipped over, marking the 60th hour since finding my freezing daughter. Outside, the public execution of Simone had fractured whatever fragile alliance Trent and his family possessed. Through the rear security feed, I watched my husband stalk across the frozen backyard. He moved with a feral energy, entirely stripped of his usual polished arrogance. The pristine snow crunched heavily under his shoes as he bypassed the illuminated patio areas, keeping out of the direct line of sight from the street and the prying eyes of the neighbors. He believed he was being incredibly stealthy, but my cameras tracked his every erratic movement. He marched directly toward the small wooden garden shed positioned near the edge of the property line. He yanked the latch open and rummaged through the dark interior, emerging moments later clutching a heavy solid tire iron. His knuckles were bone-white, gripping the cold metal weapon with a terrifying intensity. He turned his sights on the back patio door. He assumed the rear entrance was the most vulnerable point in my defensive perimeter. I had studied his behavioral patterns for years, and I knew total public humiliation would drive him to physical violence. He marched up the wooden steps of the back deck, his breath pluming in the freezing winter air. He raised the heavy iron bar high above his head and brought it crashing down against the thick glass pane. The specialized shatterproof film I installed absorbed the initial impact, spiderwebbing the glass, but holding the structural integrity intact. Trent let out a guttural scream of absolute fury and struck the door a second time, putting the entire weight of his body behind the blow. The reinforced glass finally gave way, shattering inward and raining sharp crystalline shards across the hardwood floor of the sunroom. He had breached the physical perimeter. He expected a deafening alarm to trigger the moment the glass broke. He expected flashing strobe lights and automated police dispatch warnings to flood the property. Instead, he was met with total absolute silence. I had disabled the localized vibration sensors on that specific door, creating a silent welcoming funnel directly into the heart of my home. He believed he was taking back control, initiating a dominant strike against an opponent hiding behind locked doors. He had absolutely no comprehension of the reality awaiting him. I had spent countless hours training for high-stakes infiltration scenarios, and I knew how a compromised intruder thought. His blind fury blinded him to the glaring inconsistencies in my defensive posture. He did not pause to consider why a woman who had just locked him out of his financial existence would leave a garden shed unlocked, or why a shattered door triggered 0 external alarms. His massive ego simply propelled him forward, driving him relentlessly into the jaws of a perfectly executed military trap. Trent stepped through the jagged opening, his boots crunching loudly over the broken glass. He stood in the dark sunroom, panting heavily, his chest heaving with exertion and pure adrenaline. The house was pitch black, save for the pale moonlight filtering through the shattered patio door. He gripped the tire iron tightly, his eyes darting frantically across the shifting shadows. He opened his mouth and began to scream my name. His voice tore through the quiet house, dripping with venom and absolute panic. He demanded that I show myself right, that instant, reverse the offshore bank transfers, and return his stolen wealth immediately. He bellowed that I needed to fix the social media broadcast before Simone faced federal prosecution and dragged him down with her. He hurled vicious threats into the empty air, promising to destroy my military career and take my daughter away forever if I did not comply with his demands. His words were a chaotic jumble of extortion and pathetic pleading, revealing the absolute collapse of his psychological stability. I had spent the last hour preparing the physical layout of the first floor, moving the heavy furniture, clearing all obstacles from the main corridor to create an unobstructed pathway leading straight into the kitchen. The kitchen was the largest room on the ground floor, providing the necessary space for close quarters combat. The tile floor was hard and unforgiving, offering perfect traction for military maneuvers. I stood perfectly still in the deep shadows of the walk-in pantry, my breathing slow and completely regulated. I wore my dark tactical uniform, blending entirely into the darkness. I tracked his heavy, clumsy footsteps as he marched down the hallway. He was making too much noise, breathing too heavily, allowing his blind rage to override any basic sense of situational awareness. He swung the tire iron wildly, knocking a framed picture off the wall, the glass shattering against the floorboards. He screamed again, demanding I unlock the digital offshore trust and surrender my assets. He crossed the threshold into the spacious kitchen, his silhouette illuminated briefly by the ambient glow of the digital clock on the oven. The moment his heavy boots hit the kitchen tile, my calculated waiting period ended. I had mentally mapped the exact distance between the pantry and the center of the kitchen floor, ensuring my trajectory was completely free of any debris or loose tiles. The ambient lighting from the appliances provided just enough illumination to highlight the outline of his muscular frame, while keeping my own position entirely cloaked in absolute darkness. I regulated my heartbeat, slowing my pulse to maintain peak physical efficiency where preparation met execution. He was fully exposed, standing on the hard ceramic surface, completely exhausted from his cold, treacherous trek and his violent entry. He was an incredibly easy target, standing completely still while screaming his ridiculous demands to the empty house. I did not use a firearm or a combat blade. A weapon was entirely unnecessary against an opponent blinded by emotion and lacking any formal combat training. I relied strictly on the advanced close-quarters tactical combat techniques drilled into me during my military service. The element of surprise was my absolute advantage. As Trent stepped deeper into the center of the kitchen, swinging the heavy iron bar, I exploded from the shadows of the pantry. I moved with silent, terrifying speed. I did not scream or announce my presence. I simply closed the distance between us in a fraction of a second. Trent only had time to widen his eyes as my dark shape materialized right in front of him. He instinctively raised the tire iron, attempting to bring the heavy weapon down toward my head. It was a slow, predictable movement fueled by anger rather than skill. I sidestepped the downward strike with minimal effort, allowing the heavy momentum of his swing to carry his center of gravity forward. I stepped firmly inside his defensive guard, seizing his extended right arm. I clamped my hands around his wrist and his triceps, locking his limb into a rigid, unbreakable joint manipulation hold. I did not fight his momentum, I simply redirected it. Using his own aggressive forward motion against him, I pivoted sharply on my heel and dropped my center of weight, throwing him entirely off balance. Trent let out a sharp gasp of shock as his feet left the floor. I executed a flawless tactical hip throw, sending his entire body crashing violently against the hard kitchen tile. The impact knocked the breath completely out of his lungs in a loud, hollow rush of air. The heavy tire iron slipped from his suddenly weak grasp, clattering loudly across the floor and sliding safely under the kitchen island far out of his reach. He was totally physically neutralized in less than 3 seconds. Before he could attempt to recover or draw breath, I dropped my weight directly onto his chest, pinning his torso firmly against the cold tile. I drove my knee aggressively into his shoulder blade, locking his right arm behind his back in a painful submission hold that completely immobilized him. He thrashed wildly beneath me, kicking his legs and attempting to buck me off, but my leverage was absolute. The more he struggled, the tighter the physical lock became. I applied just enough downward pressure to ensure he could not escape while keeping his airway clear so he could speak. His polished, arrogant facade was utterly shattered, replaced by the pathetic, frantic whimpering of a man who realized he was completely defeated. He lay pinned to the floor, absolutely dominated by the woman he had tried to discard and destroy. The physical confrontation was completely over, but the final stage of my tactical execution was just beginning. I had maneuvered him exactly into the precise physical position I required. He was cornered, trapped, and overwhelmed by pure panic. I knew that in this heightened state of total defeat, a desperate narcissist would do anything to talk his way out of the consequences. He would begin to justify his actions, and in doing so, he would freely hand me the very last piece of ammunition I needed to permanently seal his federal prison sentence. I kept my weight perfectly balanced, watching his eyes dart wildly around the dark kitchen as he prepared to deliver the final component of his own absolute destruction. I adjusted my grip slightly, sending a fresh wave of sharp discomfort through his pinned shoulder, ensuring his focus remained entirely on the physical reality of his capture. He squeezed his eyes shut, panting heavily as the remaining adrenaline left his system, leaving him utterly exhausted. I waited patiently, letting the heavy tactical silence absolutely deafen him. He tried to squirm again, but the tile floor offered no leverage, and my combat boots kept him securely anchored. The once domineering husband who had so easily abandoned a small child to freeze was now fully broken, sobbing quietly against the cold floorboards. The psychological collapse was total and complete, setting the perfect stage for his final irreversible mistake. The 60 hours of relentless pressure had successfully yielded the ultimate tactical advantage, and I was completely ready to close the trap. I maintained my center of gravity directly over his spine, driving my knee with calibrated precision into the narrow space between his shoulder blades. The cold ceramic tile of the kitchen floor offered no forgiveness against his face. He thrashed beneath me with the wild, uncoordinated energy of a desperate, cornered animal. He kicked his heavy boots violently against the wooden baseboards and twisted his torso in a futile, frantic attempt to dislodge my anchored weight. My advanced military conditioning took absolute precedence over the chaotic adrenaline currently coursing through his veins. I secured his right arm at a severely punishing angle, applying a specialized joint lock that required only a fraction of an inch of downward pressure to instantly immobilize his entire upper body without causing injury. The pristine suburban husband mask, the carefully curated persona he proudly wore to neighborhood barbecues and exclusive corporate dinners, shattered into completely unrecognizable fragments. He was entirely reduced to a gasping, sweating mess of pure primal panic. The heavy, suffocating silence of the dark kitchen heavily amplified the sound of his ragged, uneven breathing. I subtly shifted my tactical stance just enough to allow his diaphragm to expand, giving him the necessary oxygen he needed to speak, while simultaneously ensuring he remained entirely physically subdued. I needed him conscious, coherent, and highly motivated to vocalize his internal thought process. In his frantic, unhinged state, Trent desperately sought to regain any semblance of control over the rapidly deteriorating situation. Stripped of his stolen financial assets, locked out of his digital life, and now entirely physically dominated by the woman he had severely underestimated, his arrogant ego violently fractured into pieces. He could not process the absolute reality of his massive defeat. He attempted to use his physical size to intimidate me one final time, pushing against my hold. But I simply increased the leverage on his trapped wrist, sending a sharp shock of blinding discomfort through his shoulder. The sudden pain immediately short-circuited his physical rebellion, forcing him to abandon his physical struggle and resort entirely to verbal manipulation. He began to aggressively shout his twisted justifications into the empty kitchen. His voice echoed off the dark cabinets, dripping with a toxic mixture of immense arrogance and pathetic victimhood. He attempted to frame the horrific events of the past few days as a series of unfortunate misunderstandings, heavily shifting the blame away from himself. He arrogantly claimed that my demanding military career had forced him to make difficult, spontaneous decisions regarding household management, trying to desperately validate his betrayal. He painted himself as an overwhelmed, stressed provider who was simply trying to balance the immense pressures of his sophisticated lifestyle. I remained utterly silent, a cold, immovable stone, pressing him firmly into the consequences of his own vile actions. My absolute lack of verbal response only fueled his escalating manic desperation. Driven by a blinding need to save himself, Trent turned on his own family with breathtaking speed. He loudly confessed everything, throwing his own mother directly into the line of fire. He frantically detailed the exact events that occurred in the driveway before their luxury flight to Aspen. He admitted that Barbara was the one who violently grabbed the arms of my 7-year-old daughter. He described how Mia was crying and begging not to be left behind, annoying the older woman, who fiercely demanded a quiet, stress-free departure for her highly anticipated, expensive, exclusive getaway. He explicitly stated that his mother deliberately pinched the child with excessive cruel force, leaving those dark finger-shaped bruises, because she wanted the girl to stop ruining the joyful mood of their impending luxury vacation. He spoke of the assault with chilling casualness, framing the physical abuse of a helpless child as a minor necessary disciplinary action executed by a stressed grandmother. The confession did not stop at the physical assault. Eager to entirely absolve himself of the most severe child endangerment charges, Trent aggressively shifted his narrative to the freezing garage. He openly admitted that he personally carried my crying daughter away from the warmth of the house and threw her onto the cold concrete floor. He shouted his horrific rationale, claiming they simply did not want to waste their stolen funds, paying exorbitant holiday rates for a last-minute overnight babysitter before their morning flight. He confessed that they needed every single available dollar to maintain their wealthy facade during their exclusive ski trip. He arrogantly declared that he locked the heavy wooden door himself, intentionally leaving her in the freezing temperatures because he genuinely believed the harsh environment would force her to toughen up and stop acting like a burdensome emotional anchor. He expressed absolutely zero remorse for abandoning a freezing child, viewing her potential death as nothing more than a convenient solution to a logistical travel problem. Every single vile word spilling from his mouth solidified his absolute monstrous nature. He meticulously detailed the premeditated nature of the abandonment, explicitly confirming that the entire family was fully aware the child was locked in the unheated structure, while they eagerly boarded their leased private jet. He loudly reiterated that Mia was an outsider who never belonged in their pure family bloodline, treating her. He treated her existence as a completely disposable nuisance, holding absolutely no inherent value. He poured out his entire criminal conspiracy, operating under the deeply flawed assumption that if he simply explained his twisted logic, I would somehow understand and release him. He believed that his status and his arrogant justifications would shield him from any real accountability. He had absolutely no idea that he was currently digging his own federal grave with every single syllable he uttered. I listened to the entirety of his sickening monologue, committing every vile admission to memory. The sheer volume of evidence he was voluntarily providing exceeded my most optimistic tactical projections. He had single-handedly confessed to felony child endangerment conspiracy to commit bodily harm and premeditated neglect, all while attempting to justify his actions. The 60-hour psychological siege had worked perfectly, eroding his mental filters until he completely freely offered rope. He freely offered the very rope needed to hang his entire family. When his frantic shouting finally subsided into exhausted, ragged gasps, I decided it was time to execute the final devastating maneuver. I slowly shifted my body weight, relieving a fraction of the pressure on his spine, allowing him to slightly turn his head toward the center of the kitchen. I did not speak a single word. I simply extended my free hand, pointing deliberately toward the sleek marble surface of the kitchen island, illuminating in the ambient light. Resting perfectly in the center of the dark countertop was my military encrypted mobile device. The large high-definition screen was brilliantly illuminated, casting a pale blue glow across the room. The speakerphone function was currently active, indicated by a prominent pulsing green icon. The screen displayed an active merged conference call featuring two highly distinct outgoing connections running simultaneously. I calmly and quietly informed the gasping man beneath me of the exact nature of his current digital audience. I explained that the first active connection was routed directly to the local emergency dispatch center, maintaining an open continuous line with law enforcement personnel. I then revealed that the second merged connection was linked directly to a high-level federal investigator operating within the Regional Child Protective Services Task Force. I stated that the emergency operators and the federal agent had been listening silently to the entire altercation from the exact moment he shattered the glass of my patio door. Trent stared at the illuminated screen of the mobile device, his eyes widening in absolute, unadulterated terror. The color rapidly drained from his face, leaving him a sickly pale white. He opened his mouth, but no sound emerged. The realization of his catastrophic, irreversible mistake crashed down heavily, crushing him. The realization crushed the last remnants of his arrogant pride. He understood with brutal clarity that his entire violent, remorseless confession, detailing the exact mechanisms of his child abuse and premeditated neglect, had been legally and permanently recorded on a federally monitored emergency line. He had voluntarily provided the authorities with an airtight, irrefutable verbal confession. The oppressive silence of the dark kitchen was suddenly and violently pierced by a sharp rising sound, originating from the dark suburban streets outside. A low, distant wail steadily grew in volume and intensity, tearing through the freezing winter night. The sharp mechanical howl of multiple approaching emergency sirens echoed loudly off the surrounding houses, signaling the rapid convergence of a massive coordinated police response. The flashing red and blue lights began to dance wildly against the walls of the kitchen, casting long, chaotic shadows across the floorboards, illuminating absolute, complete failure. 1,500 words. The flashing red and blue lights bouncing against the kitchen walls signaled the absolute end of the physical confrontation. Heavily armed local police and federal agents swarmed the property, securing the perimeter and dragging a completely shattered Trent out into the freezing night. The transition from my kitchen floor to the sterile holding cells was swift and entirely devoid of mercy. By the morning of the third day, the atmosphere had shifted from chaotic action to cold institutional reality. The local police precinct was a sprawling concrete fortress humming with administrative efficiency and the harsh scent of industrial cleaning supplies. I walked down a long fluorescent-lit corridor alongside a senior federal investigator assigned to the Child Protective Services Task Force. We approached a specialized observation room featuring a massive pane of reinforced two-way glass. On the other side of that heavily smudged window sat the four people who had orchestrated the destruction of my family. Trent, Barbara, Connor, and Simone were arranged tightly around a scratched metal table. The transformation they had undergone over the past 12 hours was nothing short of spectacular. The luxurious designer ski apparel and carefully curated aesthetic they had proudly flaunted in Colorado were completely gone. They were all uniformly dressed in stiff, oversized orange jumpsuits issued by the county holding facility. The bright prison fabric hung loosely on their frames, stripping them of every single ounce of their fabricated superiority. Simone, the African-American luxury influencer who had mocked my military lifestyle, was virtually unrecognizable. Her expensive hair extensions were tangled and matted. Her meticulously applied makeup was completely washed away, revealing the exhausted, terrified reality underneath her digital facade. She sat with her shoulders hunched forward, her posture projecting pure, unadulterated defeat. She had spent years building a fraudulent empire on stolen blood money, and the stark reality of the interrogation room had finally crushed her narcissistic delusion. Connor sat beside his wife, shivering uncontrollably despite the regulated temperature of the precinct. He kept his eyes glued to the scuffed floorboards, completely unable to process the catastrophic consequences of his cowardly complicity. He looked like a frightened child waiting for punishment. Next to him sat Barbara. The domineering matriarch who had violently grabbed a 7-year-old girl and orchestrated the theft of a sacred survivor fund was utterly diminished. The arrogant sneer she perpetually wore had vanished. She looked small, fragile, and entirely stripped of her toxic authority. Trent was positioned at the center of the table, directly facing the two-way mirror. The physical and psychological dismantling I had subjected him to was clearly visible in his frantic, bloodshot eyes. The smooth, confident corporate persona he used to charm his colleagues was completely eradicated. He was a cornered animal trapped in a concrete cage, desperately searching for an exit that did not exist. The federal investigator opened the heavy steel door and stepped into the interrogation room, leaving the door slightly ajar. I followed closely behind him, taking a seat at the far end of the table, directly across from the family that had tried to destroy my child. I did not slouch or display a single ounce of fatigue. I sat with impeccable military posture, my spine perfectly straight, my hands resting calmly on the cool metal surface. I wore my dark tactical uniform, presenting a stark contrast to their humiliating prison attire. The heavy fabric of my jacket served as a visual reminder of the authority they had so foolishly mocked. I did not speak a single word. I simply leveled my gaze at Trent, allowing the suffocating weight of my silence to press down heavily upon his chest. The moment I sat down, the floodgates of their pathetic desperation violently burst open. Trent immediately leaned across the table, his manacles clinking sharply against the metal. Tears streamed freely down his face, mixing with the sweat on his forehead. He abandoned every remaining shred of his dignity, launching into a frantic, breathless stream of bargaining. He sobbed openly, begging for leniency, pleading with me to recognize the years we had spent together. He attempted to leverage our past, trying to ignite a spark of marital sympathy that had been completely incinerated the moment I found my daughter in the freezing garage. When emotional manipulation failed to elicit a reaction, he desperately pivoted to financial negotiation. He arrogantly believed that money could serve as an absolute shield against federal prosecution. He began offering up assets as if we were negotiating a standard corporate contract rather than his impending prison sentence. He frantically promised to immediately liquidate the luxury Aspen timeshare they had recently purchased. He swore he would sell the high-end imported vehicles currently sitting in the impound lot. He babbled about draining his investment portfolios and emptying his retirement accounts to pay back every single cent of the military survivor fund he had stolen. His bargaining became increasingly unhinged as my silence stretched on. He promised that if I simply dropped the massive kidnapping, child endangerment, and wire fraud charges, they would all walk away and never bother me or Mia again. He swore they would pack up whatever belongings they had left and move across the country, completely erasing themselves from our lives. He offered to sign away all his parental rights, his marital assets, and his dignity in exchange for his physical freedom. He was literally attempting to purchase a get-out-of-jail-free card using the very wealth he had fraudulently acquired. The rest of the family quickly joined the desperate chorus, sensing that Trent was failing to secure a lifeline. Barbara leaned forward, her voice trembling as she attempted to apologize for the physical abuse. She spun a pathetic narrative, claiming she was simply overwhelmed and stressed, completely disregarding the brutal reality of her actions. She begged me to consider her advanced age, claiming a federal prison sentence would surely kill her. Connor began shifting blame, crying that he was only following the instructions of his mother and brother, demanding mercy for his passive involvement. Simone directed her frantic pleading entirely toward her ruined public image. She cried about the viral live stream, begging me to reverse the malware script and issue a public statement clearing her name. She offered to transfer all her social media revenue directly into my accounts if I would just make the nightmare stop. She was facing decades behind bars, yet her primary concern remained her fabricated internet celebrity status and her vanished brand sponsorships. They were all completely drowning in their own delusions, stubbornly clinging to the belief that their stolen privilege still possessed some form of tangible value. I sat across from them, absorbing every pathetic tear and every frantic promise. I did not blink. I did not nod. I maintained a mask of absolute cold authority. I listened to their desperate bargaining with a profound sense of tactical satisfaction. I intentionally allowed them to build a fragile house of cards based entirely on the false premise that they still controlled their financial destiny. I let them exhaust themselves spinning elaborate plans to sell houses they did not own and liquidate accounts that no longer existed. It was a crucial component of the psychological warfare I was conducting. I wanted them to experience a fleeting, agonizing moment of false hope. I wanted them to genuinely believe that if they just promised enough money, if they just cried hard enough, they could somehow buy their way out of a federal indictment. I watched Trent wipe his nose on the sleeve of his orange jumpsuit. His eyes locked onto mine, searching desperately for any sign of forgiveness or hesitation. He truly thought his financial offers were a valid currency in this interrogation room. The federal investigator sitting beside me remained entirely silent, expertly allowing the suspects to freely offer verbal confessions disguised as plea bargains. His pen scratched methodically across a yellow legal pad, recording their self-incrimination. Every single promise to repay the stolen funds served as an explicit admission of guilt, seamlessly adding another layer of concrete evidence to the mountain we had already compiled. I let the frantic symphony of their begging wash over me, cataloging every admission and every lie. They were entirely oblivious to the catastrophic reality waiting just around the corner. I allowed their desperate voices to fill the sterile room, letting them exhaust every single bargaining chip they thought they held. They offered properties, cars, and accounts, painting a vivid picture of the wealth they planned to sacrifice for their freedom. I simply sat there watching the digital clock on the wall tick steadily closer to the 70th hour, marking the precise end of their reign of terror. I absorbed their tears and their promises, preparing to completely obliterate the very foundation of their false hope. They firmly believed their stolen money was their ultimate salvation. They had absolutely no idea that I had already burned their entire financial world to ash long before they ever walked into this room. I leaned forward slightly, bringing my face closer to the small metallic microphone embedded directly into the center of the scratched interrogation table. The sudden shift in my posture caused an immediate ripple of anticipation to pass through the four individuals sitting across from me. Trent wiped a fresh bead of sweat from his brow, his chest heaving with desperate manufactured hope. Barbara clasped her hands together tightly, her knuckles turning white as she silently prayed that my movement signaled an impending negotiation. Connor and Simone mirrored this pathetic desperation, their wide eyes locked onto my face, completely convinced that their frantic offers to liquidate their remaining assets had finally broken through my icy exterior. They firmly believed they were about to secure a heavily discounted pathway to their physical freedom. They waited for me to name a monetary price, assuming I would demand a massive financial settlement in exchange for dropping the severe federal charges currently hanging over their heads. I allowed my gaze to travel methodically across each of their terrified, exhausted faces, cementing this specific image of their utter defeat firmly into my memory. The senior federal investigator sitting beside me remained perfectly still, his pen hovering just above his yellow legal pad. He knew exactly what I was about to deliver. I broke my extended silence, keeping my vocal modulation entirely flat and devoid of any emotional fluctuation. I did not raise my voice or display a single ounce of anger. I simply began to dismantle their entire fabricated reality with surgical, devastating precision. I addressed Trent first, specifically targeting his arrogant assumption that he still possessed any tangible leverage in this room. I informed him that his frantic, generous offers to sell the luxury Aspen timeshare and liquidate the imported vehicles were completely useless. I watched his brow furrow in deep confusion as his sleep-deprived brain struggled to comprehend my statement. I explained the fundamental, catastrophic error he had made when he forged my signature on that bank wire transfer. He had not simply stolen money from a standard civilian savings account. He had aggressively targeted and drained a highly restricted sacred military death gratuity fund. I detailed how those specific survivor benefits were heavily monitored by automated federal financial security protocols. I informed him that the very instant I regained access to my encrypted field laptop, I had not merely routed the remaining funds into an offshore blind trust. I had simultaneously flagged the massive unauthorized withdrawal directly to the Criminal Investigation Division of the Internal Revenue Service and the heavily armed Financial Oversight Branch of the Department of Defense. I watched the initial confusion on the face of my husband slowly morph into a creeping, paralyzing terror as the gravity of those two specific federal agencies finally registered in his mind. I turned my attention to Barbara and Simone, destroying the very foundation of their fraudulent luxury empire. I clearly explained that the massive suburban estate they had purchased using the blood money of my daughter was no longer theirs to sell. I informed them that under stringent federal wire fraud and embezzlement statutes, The Internal Revenue Service had already executed a sweeping immediate seizure of all their physical and digital assets. I described how government agents had officially frozen their remaining credit lines, impounded their luxury vehicles, and placed federal locks on the doors of their stolen properties. I laid out the stark, undeniable truth of their current economic reality. They were completely and utterly destitute. They possessed zero financial capital to leverage, zero properties to bargain with, and zero means of securing private legal representation. They owed massive, insurmountable federal tax debts. The psychological impact of my words struck the table with the force of a physical detonation. Simone let out a sharp, strangled gasp, covering her mouth with her trembling hands as she realized her entire glamorous identity had been legally eradicated. Connor slumped forward, burying his face against his manacled wrists, his shoulders shaking with violent, silent sobs. Barbara stared at me with wide, unblinking eyes, her mouth hanging slightly open as she struggled to breathe through the crushing weight of her absolute bankruptcy. But Trent suffered the most spectacular collapse. The arrogant, manipulative man who had locked a 7-year-old girl in a freezing garage to protect his vacation budget suddenly realized he was entirely powerless. He began to hyperventilate, clawing frantically at the collar of his bright orange prison jumpsuit, attempting to loosen fabric that was not actually tight. I did not offer them a single moment to recover from the financial devastation before dropping the ultimate legal hammer. I leaned back in my chair, projecting complete, unwavering authority. I informed them that the absolute loss of their wealth was merely the administrative consequence of their actions. The true punishment was the impending criminal prosecution. I methodically listed the severe federal charges they were now officially facing. I detailed the severe mandatory minimum sentencing guidelines for wire fraud, identity theft, and the coordinated embezzlement of military-dependent funds. I then highlighted the most damaging charge of all, outlining the severe penalties for the premeditated physical abuse and extreme endangerment of a minor child. I stated clearly that the irrefutable medical evidence of the severe hypothermia and the dark bruising, coupled with their own recorded verbal confessions, guaranteed a remarkably swift and an utterly brutal federal conviction. I informed them they were looking at decades locked inside a maximum security federal penitentiary. Trent completely broke. He slammed his manacled hands violently against the metal table, screaming that this was impossible and begging the federal investigator to intervene. The investigator simply closed his legal pad and adjusted his glasses, completely ignoring the frantic, pathetic outburst. Barbara began to wail, a high-pitched, grating sound of pure panic, demanding to speak to a lawyer she could no longer afford. Simone rocked back and forth, muttering incoherently about her ruined reputation and her destroyed life. They were entirely consumed by the blinding, chaotic terror of their own inevitable destruction. They had attempted to completely erase my daughter from their perfect world, and in return, I had systematically, completely, and permanently erased their freedom, their wealth, and their future. I had fulfilled every single promise I made to myself today. I turned my attention to the large digital clock mounted high on the cinderblock wall of the interrogation room. The bright red numbers shifted in unison. It was exactly the 70th hour since I had carried my shivering, broken child out of the freezing darkness. The tactical operation was officially concluded. My mission was an absolute success. I stood up from the metal chair, smoothing the dark fabric of my military uniform. I did not offer them a final parting word or a vindictive smirk. They were no longer worthy of my time or my attention. They were simply broken pieces of a toxic past I was leaving permanently behind. I picked up a sealed evidence bag resting near the edge of the table. Inside the transparent plastic, the crumpled oil-stained envelope sat perfectly preserved, serving as the ultimate symbol of their greed and their downfall. I turned my back on the screaming family and walked toward the heavy steel door. The federal investigator opened it for me, offering a firm nod as I crossed the threshold. The heavy door swung shut instantly, cutting off the frantic sounds of their ruin. The heavy click of the locking mechanism echoed with profound finality through the sterile corridor. I walked through the busy precinct, my posture relaxed and my breathing calm. I navigated the bustling maze of uniformed officers and administrative staff, feeling an immense, profound sense of lightness settling over my shoulders. The suffocating weight of the past 2 years, the constant subtle manipulation, and the toxic hidden abuse had been entirely, completely eradicated. I pushed open the heavy glass double doors of the precinct and stepped out into the crisp, bright winter morning. The freezing air felt incredibly clean and revitalizing against my face. The snow had stopped falling, leaving the city blanketed in a pristine, sparkling layer of white. I walked confidently down the concrete steps toward my parked tactical vehicle. Standing sharply at attention beside the front bumper was a highly decorated senior naval officer. His dress uniform was immaculate, and his posture conveyed deep professional respect. He saluted me smartly as I approached, a gesture I immediately and crisply returned. He held out a thick, heavily sealed military dossier bearing the highest level clearance markings. He formally informed me that my recent overseas cyber intelligence operation had been deemed an unprecedented success. He stated that Command had officially authorized a significant early promotion and a transfer to a highly secure elite base in Hawaii. I thanked him and opened my car door. Mia sat inside, recovering perfectly and smiling. I strapped her in, leaving the ruined family behind. We drove off to start our untouchable life.
I used to ride upon your shoulders, thinking you could touch the sky. Every road felt less uncertain when I saw the world through your eyes. You were stronger than the mountains, taller than the northern pines. And when the winter winds were coming, you would stand between them and I. Time kept moving like the river, years slipped slowly out to sea. But no matter where life took me, you were always part of me. I am my father's daughter, in every step I take, in every time I choose to stand. When it's easier to break, I carry your courage in my heart, your fire inside my soul. And though the years keep moving on, your love still leads me home. You taught me strength is not in power, but in kindness when it's hard. You taught me how to keep on going when the road grows cold and dark. Every lesson, every story, every laugh around the flame lies within me like an echo, calling softly through my name. And when I face my greatest battles, when I feel I can't go on, I can hear your voice beside me saying, child, you're stronger than you know. I am my father's daughter, in every step becomes. I am my Father's daughter, and I always will remain. Through every triumph, every loss, through every joy and every pain, the world may change around me, the stars may fade above, but I will always carry with me my Father's endless love.